At 4:32 in the morning, the phone on my nightstand screamed into the silence of my Boston estate. When I picked it up, my daughter-in-law Monica did not say hello. She did not cry. Her voice was as dry as old parchment when she delivered the news that should have destroyed me. "Your son drowned in Hawaii yesterday afternoon," she said. "I authorized an immediate cremation. He left everything to me in a new will. You get nothing, Conrad. Do not bother flying out here." The click of the line going dead was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I sat there in the dark, clutching the receiver. Most fathers would have collapsed. Most fathers would have screamed. I just smiled. You see, my son Bennett was an Ironman triathlete who could hold his breath for 4 minutes. He did not just drown in shallow water. And Monica did not know that before I retired, I was the most feared maritime lawyer on the East Coast. She thought she had pulled off the perfect crime. She was wrong. Before I tell you how I dismantled her life piece by piece using the very laws she tried to ignore, let me know in the comments if you have ever spotted a lie the moment you heard it. Hit like and subscribe if you believe justice should always be served cold. The red numbers on the digital clock stared back at me. 4:33 a.m. 1 minute had passed since my life changed forever. Outside, the autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Sullivan Manor, a sound that usually lulled me to sleep but now sounded like war drums. I did not turn on the light. I did not need to. I knew every inch of this house. It was the house my grandfather built, the house I raised Bennett in, and the house Monica had been trying to push me out of since the day she slipped a diamond ring on my so's finger. I replayed her words in my head. Immediate cremation. That was the first mistake. In the state of Hawaii and under federal maritime law, an unattended death in the ocean requires a coroner's inquest. You cannot just burn the evidence unless you pay someone to look the other way. Second mistake. The will. Bennett had a trust fund that was locked until his 50th birthday. He could not sign it away even if he wanted to. Monica had moved too fast. Her greed had outpaced her intelligence. I walked over to the fireplace where a framed photo of Bennett sat. He was crossing the finish line at the Kona Triathlon, exhausted but triumphant. My chest tightened, a sharp physical pain that threatened to buckle my knees. That was my boy. My only boy. The grief tried to claw its way out, tried to force tears from my eyes, but I swallowed it down. I pushed the sorrow into a cold, dark room in the back of my mind and locked the door. There would be time for mourning later. Right now, I needed to be Conrad Sullivan, the attorney who once made an insurance giant pay out $50 million for a faulty life vest. I walked to my heavy oak desk and opened the bottom drawer. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and my old fountain pen. I did not call the airlines. I did not call relatives. I sat down and wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Autopsy. Jurisdiction. Motive. Monica had told me I had nothing. She told me not to come. She thought I was just a frail, 72-year-old man with bad knees and a fading memory. She was about to find out that a shark does not lose its teeth just because it stops swimming. I picked up the phone again. I was not calling her back. I was dialing the private number of the harbor master in Maui. The sun was just rising in Boston, but for Monica, the long, dark night was just beginning. I am Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward, smirking. "You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our 4-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom painted pale blue. At my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary in prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight, as joined honor societies, and 2 days of silence followed that phone call. I did not sleep. I sat in the library watching the driveway security feed on my iPad. I knew she would come. Criminals always return to the scene of the crime, especially when the crime scene is a $20 million estate they think they just inherited. I expected a hearse or perhaps a somber black limousine. I expected her to wear a veil, to play the part of the grieving widow for at least a week. I gave her too much credit. At noon, a bright yellow taxi pulled up to the front gate. Monica stepped out. She was not wearing black. She was wearing a cocktail dress the color of fresh blood. It was tight, revealing, and completely inappropriate for a woman who had allegedly cremated her husband 48 hours ago. She looked like she was arriving at a gala, not a funeral home. She didn't even carry her own bags. She watched the driver haul 3 massive suitcases up the stairs, checking her makeup in her compact mirror while he struggled. I did not open the door for her. She used her key, the one Bennett had given her against my advice 3 years ago. The heavy oak door swung open, and the sound of her high heels clicking on the marble foyer echoed like gunshots. She walked straight into the library, bringing a cloud of expensive, cloying perfume with her. In her hands, she held a small wooden box. It was unfinished pine, rough and splintered, the kind of box used to ship cheap machine parts. She did not say hello. She walked past me and tossed the box onto the antique coffee table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud, sliding across the surface and scratching the French polish my grandfather had applied by hand. The disrespect was physical. It was a slap in the face. "Here is your son," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion other than annoyance. "The shipping cost a fortune. I hope you appreciate the effort I took to bring him back to you." I looked at the box. It was the size of a shoebox, sealed with simple staples. I reached out and picked it up. Immediately my stomach turned, but not from grief. It was from instinct. I spent 40 years investigating maritime accidents. I know the density of bone ash. A man of Bennett's size, an athlete with dense bone structure, yields about 6 pounds of cremains. This box weighed nearly 10. I shifted the box slightly in my hands. The contents moved sluggishly, heavy and damp. Bone ash is dry, gritty, and light. It shifts like dry sand. This felt like wet gravel. This felt like sediment. My mind raced. She had been in such a rush to get back to Boston and claim her prize that she had not even bothered to fake the ashes correctly. She had filled a box with whatever she could find on the beach and sealed it up. "You are quiet, old man," Monica said, throwing herself onto the leather sofa. She kicked off her red heels, resting her bare feet on the table next to the box. "I suppose you are in shock. Well, get over it quickly. We have work to do. This house is depressing. I am calling a contractor tomorrow to gut this library. And Conrad, pack your things. The guest house is ready for you. I need the master suite for myself. I need space to heal." I set the box down gently. I did not scream. I did not accuse her. I simply looked at the woman who had just dumped a box of wet sand on my table and called it my son. I looked at her red dress, her bored expression, and her utter confidence that I was a helpless senior citizen. "Welcome home, Monica," I said softly. She did not hear the ice in my voice. She only heard the surrender. She had no idea that the heavy pine box sitting between us was the first piece of evidence that would eventually destroy her. She did not stop there. The box of fake ashes was just the opening act. Before I could even withdraw my hand from the rough wood, Monica reached into her alligator skin handbag and pulled out a thick, folded document. She dropped it onto the table with a sharp slap that echoed in the silent library. It was not a letter. It was a court order, specifically an emergency motion for exclusive occupancy of the marital residence. I recognized the judge's signature immediately. He was a man I had played golf with for 20 years, a man who clearly had been swayed by a weeping young widow claiming she felt unsafe living with an unstable, grieving father-in-law. Read it and weep. Conrad, Monica said, examining her fingernails. The judge agrees that in my fragile state I need privacy. You make me uncomfortable. You remind me too much of him. The order says you have 24 hours to vacate the main premises. But because I am generous, and because Bennett would have wanted me to be kind to the elderly, I am allowing you to move into the guest house. I looked out the window toward the guest house. It was a converted carriage house at the edge of the property, damp, drafty, and currently used to store pool chemicals and old lawnmowers. It was a place for servants, not the man who had paid for every brick of this estate. She was not just evicting me. She was demoting me. She wanted to strip away my dignity before she stripped away my assets. She waited for me to explode. She wanted me to scream, to tear up the paper, to give her a reason to call the police and have me removed by force. Instead, I picked up the document and folded it neatly into my pocket. I stood up, smoothing the front of my cardigan. I will move my things immediately, I said, my voice calm and measured. But Monica, I have just one question before I go. She rolled her eyes, already reaching for the bottle of wine. Make it quick, old man. I leaned in, slightly lowering my voice to a professional, inquisitive tone. Since Bennett died in navigable waters, the investigation falls under federal jurisdiction. I was wondering if the Coast Guard captain of the port provided you with a copy of the Form 2692 report of marine casualty. I need the file number for the insurance claim. Monica froze. The glass of wine stopped halfway to her lips. Her eyes darted to the side, a classic tale of a liar searching for a script that does not exist. Form 2692. She stammered, her confidence cracking for a fraction of a second. Jared handled the paperwork. It was an accident, Conrad. The police said it was just a tragic accident. Why are you obsessing over forms? I nodded slowly, pretending to accept her non-answer. Of course. Jared handled it. I am sure he was very thorough. I turned and walked out of the library, leaving her standing there with her wine and her unease. She did not know what a Form 2692 was. She did not know that without it, a death at sea is technically considered a disappearance, triggering a mandatory FBI inquiry if an insurance claim exceeds $1 million. She thought she had won the battle for the house. She had no idea she had just confirmed that there was no official investigation, and in doing so she had given me the first weapon I needed to hunt her down. As I walked toward the damp guest house in the rain, I felt younger than I had in years. The game was afoot. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in audacity. I expected a quiet meal, perhaps a somber reflection on the life we had just lost. Instead, Monica walked into the dining room with a man I had never seen before. She introduced him as Jared. He was tall-tanned and had the sun-bleached hair of a man who spent his life on the water. She claimed he was the dive master from Maui, the man who had tried to save Bennett. She said he had flown all the way to Boston to offer emotional support during this difficult transition. I shook his hand. It was rough, calloused, and his grip was arrogant. He did not look like a grieving witness. He looked like a man surveying a property he intended to buy. They sat together on one side of the table, leaving me isolated on the other. The disrespect began before the soup was served. Jared reached for the wine bottle sitting in the center of the table. It was not just any bottle. It was a 1982 Chateau Margaux, a vintage Bennett had been saving for his 10th wedding anniversary. Jared popped the cork with a casual indifference that made my blood boil. He filled Monica's glass to the brim, then his own without even glancing at me. "Cheers to new beginnings," Jared said, clinking his glass against hers. I cut my steak in silence, watching them over the rim of my water glass. They were not behaving like a widow and a supportive friend. Their body language screamed intimacy. Jared sat too close. His arm rested on the back of her chair. When he laughed at something, she whispered, his knee grazed hers under the table. I saw it. I saw the familiarity in the way he tore his bread, the way he looked at her mouth when she spoke. This was not a relationship forged in the trauma of the last 48 hours. This was an affair that had been simmering long before my son took his last breath. So Monica said, twirling her wine glass, "Jared thinks we should liquidate the garage. Those old cars are just gathering dust. The Shelby Cobra alone could finance the expansion of Jared's dive shop in Kihei. It is what Bennett would have wanted. He always supported small businesses." She looked at me, daring me to object. She wanted a fight. She wanted me to defend the cars so she could call me sentimental and senile. I did not give her the satisfaction. I looked at Jared, who was busy chewing on a piece of prime rib paid for by the man he had watched die. I noticed he was wearing a brand-new Rolex Submariner. It was the same model Bennett had bought for himself 2 months ago. "That sounds like a practical financial decision," I said, wiping my mouth with the linen napkin. "Cars are terrible investments in this economy." Jared blinked, surprised by my capitulation. He exchanged a look with Monica, a look of triumph. They thought I was broken. They thought I was rolling over. They did not know that I was merely letting them get comfortable. I was letting them think they were the predators at this table. But as I watched Jared pour another glass of my son's wine, I was already drafting the subpoena that would expose exactly how long he and Monica had been planning this so-called accident. I spent the next hour in my study, but I did not pack the way a man evicted from his own home usually packs. I left the cashmere sweaters folded in the cedar closet. I left the family photo albums on the shelves. Those things belonged to a father and a grandfather, and right now I could not afford to be either. I needed to be a litigator. I opened the wall safe behind the portrait of my late wife. I did not take the cash or the gold coins. I took 3 banker's boxes of files I had kept from my days at the firm. These were not case files. They were contact lists. Private investigators, forensic accountants, and salvage divers who owed me favors. At the bottom of the safe sat my old Olympus pearl recorder. It was a microcassette recorder from 1995, scratched and dented, but it still worked perfectly. It had recorded the confessions of embezzlers, the lies of insurance fraudsters, and the last words of captains who ran their ships aground. I put fresh batteries in it and slid it into my breast pocket. It felt heavier than a gun, and in my hands it was far more dangerous. I dragged my single suitcase down the grand staircase. The wheels clicked rhythmically against the marble, a lonely sound in the cavernous house. The front door was heavy, and as I pushed it open, the Boston rain hit me like a cold rag. It was a miserable night, the kind of weather that chills you to the bone, but I welcomed it. The cold kept me sharp. I walked down the cobblestone path toward the guest house. To call it a guest house was generous. It was a glorified storage shed near the pool filter room. It smelled of chlorine and gasoline. The heating system had been broken since the blizzard of 2010, and the furniture was covered in dust sheets. This was where Monica expected me to live out my remaining years, invisible and silent, grateful for whatever scraps she threw my way. When I reached the door of the shed, I turned back to look at the main house. The windows of the master bedroom were glowing with warm golden light. The curtains were drawn back. Monica was standing on the balcony, sheltered by the overhang. She was still wearing that blood-red dress, holding a fresh glass of wine. She looked down at me, shivering in the rain with my suitcase, and she smiled. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated malice. She raised her glass in a mock toast, a silent salute to her victory. She thought she was looking at a defeated old man, banished to the servants' quarters. She did not realize she had just made a tactical error. By putting me in the guest house, she had given me a direct line of sight to the study, the living room, and the driveway. She had not exiled me. She had inadvertently set me up in an observation post. I unlocked the flimsy door of the shed and stepped into the dark. I did not unpack my clothes. I set up my desk, placed the recorder in the center, and pulled the first file from the box. My watch began. The reading of the will took place the following morning in the very library Monica had threatened to gut. She had not gutted it yet, likely, because she needed the gravitas of the room to legitimize the theft she was about to commit. Robert Sterling, the family attorney I had employed for 30 years, sat behind my desk. He did not look at me. He was sweating small beads of perspiration gathering on his upper lip despite the air conditioning. That was the first tell. Robert was a man who had stared down federal prosecutors without blinking yet today in the presence of a former swimsuit model and a dive instructor. He was trembling. He cleared his throat and opened the leather folder. The document inside was crisp, the paper white and fresh. It did not look like a document drafted after careful consideration. It looked like something printed at a hotel business center. I, Bennett Sullivan, being of sound mind and body, Robert read, his voice cracking slightly, hereby revoke all prior wills and testaments. I leave my entire estate, including the Sullivan Manor, the investment portfolio, the vintage automobile collection, and all liquid assets totaling approximately $40 million to my beloved wife, Monica. Monica let out a small, staged gasp. She squeezed Jared's hand, burying her face in his shoulder. It was a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. Jared patted her back, but his eyes were glued to the folder, mentally calculating his cut. Robert continued reading the clause that was meant to break me. To my father, Conrad Sullivan, I leave nothing. It is my belief that he has ample resources of his own, and our relationship has deteriorated to a point where I no longer wish for him to benefit from my legacy. The room went silent. Monica peeked out from behind her hands to see my reaction. She wanted anger. She wanted me to shout that the will was a forgery, that Bennett would never write such a thing. And she was right. Bennett did not write it. I could see the signature from where I sat. It was shaky, the loops of the B and S distorted. It was the signature of a man under duress, or perhaps a digital copy pasted onto a new document. But to prove that I needed the original, and right now the original was in Robert's trembling hands. If I objected now, they would circle the wagons. They would destroy the laptop used to draft it. They would burn the drafts. I needed them to think the war was over. I needed them to think the old lion had lost his teeth. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the desk. Robert flinched, expecting a blow. "Where do I sign?" I asked. Monica's head snapped up. "What?" "The acknowledgement," I said, pointing to the bottom of the page. "The waiver of contest. If Bennett wanted me to have nothing, then I respect his wishes. I am too old to fight for money I do not need." Robert pushed the paper toward me, relief washing over his face. He handed me his pen. I took it, and for a brief second, I looked him in the eye. He looked away, ashamed. He had been bought. I signed my name with a steady hand. Conrad Sullivan. With that signature, I legally stripped myself of $40 million. Monica let out a laugh that was sharp and victorious. She stood up and poured herself another drink. "You are finally showing some sense, Conrad," she said. "I am glad we could resolve this like adults." I capped the pen and set it down. I had not surrendered. By signing that document, I had lulled them into a false sense of security. They would stop looking over their shoulders. They would get sloppy. And most importantly, by accepting the will as valid, I had just locked them into a fraud charge that would carry a minimum sentence of 20 years. I walked out of the library, leaving the new multimillionaires to celebrate their windfall, knowing that the ink on my signature was the first drop of poison in their chalice. The sound that woke me was not the chirping of birds or the gentle rustle of leaves. It was the guttural roar of a diesel engine, a mechanical growl that shook the thin walls of the garden shed. Dust drifted down from the ceiling rafters, coating my face. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs, a terrible premonition seizing my chest. I scrambled out of the narrow cot and rushed to the dirty window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A massive yellow bulldozer was tearing across the manicured lawn, its steel tracks chewing up the emerald grass I had tended for decades. It was not heading for the driveway. It was heading straight for the south corner of the estate. The rose garden. I did not stop to put on shoes. I did not grab my cane. I burst out of the shed, sprinting across the wet grass in my pajamas. That garden was not just a collection of flowers. It was a sanctuary. 40 years ago, my late wife Eleanor had planted those hybrid tea roses with her own hands. And 10 years ago, I had mixed her ashes into the soil beneath the central white bush, the one she loved the most. It was her resting place. It was sacred ground. "Stop!" I screamed, waving my arms as I ran toward the machine. "Stop it right now!" The driver did not hear me, or perhaps he chose to ignore the frantic old man running toward him. The machine did not slow down. Its massive steel blade lowered, ready to scrape the earth clean. Then I saw her. Monica was standing on the patio, wrapped in a silk robe, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She was wearing noise-canceling headphones, bobbing her head slightly to music directing the destruction with a casual wave of her hand. She looked like a conductor leading an orchestra of chaos. I reached the edge of the garden just as the bulldozer took its first bite of the soil. The sound of snapping wood and crushing roots was sickening. "Monica!" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Stop this! Eleanor is in there! Her ashes are in there!" Monica pulled off one side of her headphones. She looked at me with feigned pity. "Oh, Conrad, you are awake. I thought the noise might disturb you. We are clearing this old patch of weeds. An infinity pool will look much better here. It increases the property value. Bennett always wanted a pool. You cannot do this." I lunged forward, placing my body between the machine and the remaining bushes. "I will not let you desecrate her grave." "Get out of the way, old man." Monica signaled to a man standing near the back door. He was wearing a black uniform, private security she must have hired overnight. "Remove him. He is trespassing on a construction site." The guard was young, broad-shouldered, and indifferent. He marched over to me. I tried to stand my ground to channel the authority I once held in courtrooms, but I was 72 years old and exhausted. He grabbed my arm with a grip like a vice. "Let go of me." I struggled, but it was useless. "For your own safety, sir." The guard grunted, and with a casual shove, he threw me backward. I lost my footing on the slick grass. I fell hard, my hip slamming into the mud. The pain was sharp and white-hot, radiating down my leg. I lay there gasping for air, covered in dirt and humiliation. From my vantage point on the ground, I watched helplessly as the bulldozer surged forward. The steel blade tore through the white rosebush, uprooting it in a single violent motion. The soil, the flowers, and the remnants of the woman I loved were churned into a heap of brown waste. Monica took a sip of her coffee, satisfied. "See, much cleaner already." I did not try to get up again. I lay in the mud, clutching a broken rose stem that had fallen near my hand. The thorns dug into my palm, drawing blood. I watched the destruction until the garden was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly scar in the earth. I did not cry. Tears were for the grieving. I was past grief. As I squeezed the thorny stem, letting the pain sharpen my focus, I made a silent vow to my wife. Monica wanted an infinity pool. I would make sure she drowned in it. The guest house bathroom was the only room without a window facing the main estate. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the cold porcelain bathtub. My hands were still shaking slightly from the physical exertion of digging, but my mind was razor sharp. I pulled the old Nokia burner phone from the hollowed-out heel of my work boot. Monica was smart enough to monitor the landline, and perhaps even the Wi-Fi, but she would never suspect that a 72-year-old man kept a piece of 2005 technology for emergencies. I dialed a number I had memorized 15 years ago. It rang twice before a voice answered. It was not a hello. It was a statement. "You are supposed to be retired, Conrad." Kendra. I breathed out the first time I had allowed myself to exhale fully in 2 days. "I need you. It is a code black." There was a pause on the other end. Kendra had been my best paralegal before she left the firm to start her own private investigation agency. She knew what code black meant. It meant family. It meant betrayal. It meant someone was going to prison, or someone was going to the morgue. "Talk to me," she said, her voice shifting from casual to clinical. "Bennett is dead," I said. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. "Drowned in Maui yesterday. Monica claims she cremated him immediately. She is already here with the ashes, and a new will leaving her everything." "That is impossible," Kendra said immediately. "I have a contact at the Honolulu Medical Examiner's office. The backlog for autopsies on water-related deaths is 3 days minimum. Even with a private, expedited service, you cannot get a cremation permit in 24 hours without a judge's signature." "Exactly," I whispered. "She is lying. She brought back a box of sand and calls it my son. I need you to find out what really happened. I need flight manifests. I need the name of the charter boat he was on. And Kendra, there is a man here. Jared. He claims to be a dive master. He is too comfortable. He is wearing Bennett's watch. I can have the flight manifests in an hour," Kendra said. "What is your play?" "I am the gardener," I said, looking at my dirty fingernails. "I am playing the senile, beaten old man. I am going to let them think they have won while you gather the ammunition. But I need to get to Hawaii without them knowing. I will book you on a red-eye out of Logan tomorrow night, under the name Arthur Vance," Kendra replied. "Use the service entrance. I will have a car waiting." "And Conrad." "Yes. Do not kill her yourself. Let the law do it." I hung up and removed the battery from the phone. I looked at myself in the cracked mirror above the sink. The man staring back was tired gray and wearing a stained jumpsuit. But behind the eyes, the fire was returning. I washed my face with cold water, scrubbing away the dirt, but leaving the rage. I would be the gardener. I would be the ghost in their machine. And when the time was right, I would be their executioner. The next morning, I staged the most important performance of my career. I was not in a courtroom, and my audience was not a jury of 12 peers, but a woman with a heart of stone who was currently looking at fabric swatches for new curtains. I waited until she was seated at the kitchen island, sipping her third espresso. I prepared a tray with a silver pot of tea, just as she liked it. I walked slowly, dragging my left foot slightly, adding a noticeable shuffle to my step. As I approached the table, I focused on my right hand. I made it tremble. At first, it was a subtle vibration, then a rhythmic shaking that rattled the china cups against the saucers. I let the shaking travel up my arm until I was standing right beside her. Then, with a calculated slip of my fingers, I let the heavy silver tray drop. It hit the granite countertop with a deafening crash. Hot water splashed onto the floor, missing her silk slippers by an inch. The teapot shattered. Monica screamed, jumping off her stool. "You clumsy old fool! Look what you have done!" That was Limoges porcelain. I gripped the edge of the counter, breathing heavily, letting my eyes lose focus. "I am sorry, Monica," I stammered, making my voice sound thin and reedy. "It is the cold in the shed. My joints, my nerves. I cannot control my hands anymore. The dampness is killing me." She looked at me with pure disgust. She did not see a father figure in distress. She saw a broken appliance that was making a mess in her pristine kitchen. She grabbed a napkin and wiped a spot of water from the counter, ignoring the fact that I was hyperventilating. "Well, you cannot stay here if you are going to destroy the house," she snapped. I cannot have you dropping things on the contractors or guests. I lowered my head. I know. That is why I wanted to ask you a favor. I have a friend in Boca Raton. He runs a small clinic for retired legal professionals. It is warm there. The heat helps the tremors. If I could just go there for a few weeks, maybe a month, just until I stabilize. I let the sentence hang in the air. I watched her face. I could see the gears turning. She was calculating the benefits. If I was in Florida, I was out of her hair. She could move Jared into the master bedroom openly. She could throw parties without the embarrassing old gardener lurking in the background. It was the perfect solution for her. How much, she asked, her voice sharp. Just the plane ticket, I whispered. And maybe a small stipend for the clinic fees. I will stay out of your way. You will have the whole estate to yourself. She smiled. It was the smile of a jailer releasing a prisoner not out of mercy, but to save on food costs. Done, she said. I will book you a one-way ticket to Fort Lauderdale on Spirit Airlines, economy class. Do not expect first-class Conrad. Those days are over, and do not rush back. Take 2 months, take 6. Just get out of my sight. Thank you, Monica, I said, forcing a tear into the corner of my eye. You are too kind. She waved her hand dismissively, already turning back to her fabric swatches. Just clean up this mess before you go. I knelt down on the wet floor and began picking up the shards of porcelain. My hand was steady now, perfectly steady. She had bought the lie. She thought she was exiling me to a retirement clinic in Florida to rot in the sun. She had no idea she had just authorized my deployment to the front lines. As I swept the broken china into the dustpan, I smiled at the floor. Florida was a lovely decoy. But I was going hunting in the Pacific. The ride to Logan Airport was the final act of my humiliation. Monica had ordered me an Uber X, the cheapest option available to take her dying father-in-law to his exile. The driver, a kind young man who reminded me painfully of Bennett, insisted on carrying my bag to the curb. He looked at my shaking hands and my heavy cane with genuine pity. Take care of yourself, sir, he said. I nodded, keeping my head down, playing the part of the broken patriarch until the very last second. I shuffled through the terminal, dragging my left leg, stopping every few feet to catch my breath. I felt the eyes of strangers on me. They saw a relic. They saw a burden. Good. That was exactly what Monica saw. I checked in at the kiosk for the Spirit Airlines flight to Fort Lauderdale. I printed the boarding pass. I even walked to the security line assigned to that gate. But the moment I passed through the body scanner and collected my belongings on the other side, something changed. We were now in the sterile federal zone of the airport. Monica's spies, if she had any, could not follow me here. Her influence ended at the TSA checkpoint. I walked into the nearest family restroom and locked the door. I looked in the mirror. Arthur Vance, the trembling old gardener, stared back. I splashed cold water on my face. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs completely for the first time in days. Then I stood up straight. I rolled my shoulders back. A satisfying pop echoed in the small room as my spine realigned. The limp was gone. The tremors were gone. I was 6 feet 2 inches of cold, calculated rage. I picked up the cane. It was a cheap aluminum thing Monica had bought at a pharmacy. I walked out of the restroom and marched straight to a large trash bin near the duty-free shop. I did not gently place it inside. I drove it down into the garbage with force. I did not need a crutch. I needed a weapon, and I already had one in my briefcase. I walked past Gate B4 where the flight to Florida was boarding. I did not even glance at the passengers lining up to go to the retirement capital of the world. Instead, I headed for the international terminal. I approached the first-class lounge for Hawaiian Airlines. The receptionist looked up, surprised to see a man in a stained gardener's jumpsuit holding a platinum frequent flyer card. I need a change of clothes and a Scotch neat, I told her. She looked at the name on the card, then back at me. Of course, Mr. Sullivan. Welcome back. I sat by the window watching the planes take off into the gray Boston sky. Monica thought she had checkmated me. She thought the game was over. She did not realize that while she was playing checkers, I was playing chess. The flight to Honolulu was 10 hours long. That gave me 10 hours to review the case files. When I landed, I would not be a father. I would be the law. The automatic doors of Kahului Airport slid open, hitting me with a wall of humidity and the cloying scent of plumeria. To the hundreds of tourists swarming the curb, it was the smell of paradise, of honeymoons and family vacations. To me, it smelled like a crime scene. I adjusted my sunglasses, shielding my eyes not just from the glare, but from the happy, oblivious faces around me. I walked past the lay greeters and the shuttle buses, scanning the crowd for the one person I trusted to help me dig up the truth. Kendra was leaning against a battered, mud-splattered Jeep Wrangler in the loading zone. She had not changed much since she left my law firm 5 years ago to start her own private investigation agency. She still had that sharp, predatory stillness, like a cat waiting for a mouse to make a mistake. She wore cargo shorts and a faded navy t-shirt blending in with the locals, but the tablet computer tucked under her arm was strictly professional. She did not offer me a hug or a condolence. She knew me better than that. She simply nodded, unlocked the doors, and tossed her bag into the back seat. "Get in," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the terminal. "We have a lot of ground to cover, and I found something that is going to make you very angry." I climbed into the passenger seat. The air conditioning in the Jeep was broken, and the interior smelled of salt water and old coffee. As we pulled out onto the Hana Highway, merging into the flow of rental convertibles, Kendra handed me a file folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It looked like a standard municipal schedule, the kind of boring bureaucratic document most people would throw away without a second glance. "Look at the date," Kendra said, keeping her eyes on the road. "November 12th, the day Monica claims she had your son cremated." I looked at the highlighted row. It was a maintenance log for the County Environmental Services. There are only 2 licensed crematoriums on the island capable of handling human remains. Kendra explained, her voice flat and clinical. Both of them were shut down for mandatory EPA filtration inspections on the 11th, 12th, and 13th. The furnaces were cold, Conrad. Not a single fire was lit on the island that entire week. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from a cold, simmering rage. The document was irrefutable. You cannot cremate a body in a facility that is under federal lock and key for maintenance. This means the death certificate she showed me was a forgery. I said, the realization settling in like a stone in my gut. And the permit number she referenced does not exist. Exactly, Kendra replied. And that box of ashes she brought to your house, it is just wood ash and sand. She lied about the cremation because there was no body to cremate. Or rather, she had to get rid of the body some other way because she could not do it legally. I looked out the window at the vast, glittering Pacific Ocean stretching out to the horizon. Somewhere out there, beneath the beautiful blue surface, my son was waiting for me. Monica and Jared had not given him a funeral. They had treated him like garbage, disposing of him in the dark to hide their crime. So where is he? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Kendra turned the Jeep onto a dirt road leading toward the harbor. "That is what we are going to find out," she said grimly. "I pulled the satellite records. I know exactly where their boat stopped. And I know some divers who do not ask questions. We are going to bring him home, Conrad. But first, we are going to nail those bastards to the wall." Mailea Harbor was a chaotic mix of burnt tourists, diesel fumes, and the relentless cry of seagulls fighting over discarded French fries. To anyone else, it was just another sunny afternoon in paradise. To me, it was a crime scene waiting to be processed. Kendra had insisted I change out of my suit and into a ridiculous floral shirt and khaki shorts. She said I needed to look like a retiree looking for a sunset cruise, not a lawyer looking for a murder weapon. I hated the disguise. It made me feel vulnerable, but I knew she was right. If anyone from the charter company recognized me as a Sullivan, the stone wall of silence would go up instantly. We walked down the long concrete pier, dodging children with melting ice cream cones. Kendra held my arm, playing the part of the dutiful daughter, taking her father for a stroll. But her eyes were scanning the slip numbers, her mind working as fast as mine. "Slip 42, she whispered, tightening her grip on my elbow. "That is the one. The Blue Shark." The boat was a 30-foot center console, sleek and powerful, with twin Yamaha engines that screamed speed. It was the kind of boat you rent when you want to get far offshore fast. It was docked quietly, bobbing gently in the swell. There was no one on board. The crew was likely at the bar across the street, spending the tip money Jared had undoubtedly bribed them with. I let go of Kendra and walked to the edge of the dock. I pretended to admire the engines, but my eyes were focused on the starboard gunwale. I was looking for something specific. When you haul a heavy object over the side of a boat, a large fish, an anchor, or a body, it leaves a mark. Gelcoat is tough, but it is not invincible. I knelt down, feigning a need to tie my shoelace. There it was, about 2 feet back from the center cleat. A deep, jagged gouge ran vertically down the side of the hull. It was not the kind of scratch you get from rubbing against a dock piling. Dock rash is horizontal and messy. This was vertical and sharp. Something heavy had been dragged over the rail and dropped, scraping the fiberglass on its way down into the abyss. I ran my finger over the groove. It was fresh. The white fiberglass underneath the blue paint was still bright, not yet yellowed by the sun or algae. Kendra leaned over the railing next to me. "What do you see?" I stood up, wiping the invisible dust from my knees. "Starboard side. Midship. There is a gouge in the gelcoat. It is deep. And look at the cleat above it. The metal is bent slightly outward. Someone tied something heavy to a rope and dropped it over." Kendra said, her voice dropping an octave. "Not just something heavy," I corrected her. "Something that fought against the current, or something that was dead weight being pulled down by concrete blocks. That scratch is the signature of a disposal, Kendra. Jared did not just push him off, he weighed him down." I looked around. No one was watching us. The harbor master was busy with a catamaran. "I need to get on that boat," I said. "You cannot," Kendra hissed. "That is trespassing. If we get caught, the evidence becomes inadmissible." "I do not need to get on board to find what I need next," I said, pointing to the stern. "Look at the dive platform. The rubber matting is torn." There was a struggle. This wasn't a peaceful accident. This was a brawl. I took out my phone and snapped a series of photos, zooming in on the scratch, the bent cleat, and the torn mat. I had enough. The Blue Shark had just told me its story. Now I needed to find the man who wrote it. "Let's go," I said, turning back toward the parking lot. "I want to meet the owner of this vessel before he has a chance to paint over his sins." The rental office for Blue Shark Charters was little more than a plywood shack at the end of the pier. It smelled of stale beer, diesel fuel, and bad decisions. Inside, a man who looked like he had been cured in salt water and tobacco smoke sat behind a cluttered desk. He was counting a stack of cash that looked suspiciously fresh. His name, according to the embroidered patch on his greasy shirt, was Rick. He did not look up when Kendra and I walked in, not until Kendra slammed her badge onto the counter next to his money. Rick jumped, his hand instinctively covering the cash. "We are closed," he grunted, eyeing the badge. "If this is about the noise complaint last night, I already paid the fine." I stepped forward, placing a photo of Jared on top of the badge. "We are not here about the noise, Rick. We are here about him." Rick looked at the photo. His eyes flickered. It was a micro-expression, a split second of recognition, followed by a mask of indifference. But I had spent 40 years deposing liars. I saw it. "Never seen him." Rick lied. "I rent to hundreds of tourists. They all look the same." I leaned over the desk. I was wearing a floral shirt, but my voice was pure steel. "Don't lie to me, Rick. I just inspected the hull of your boat. There is a deep gouge on the starboard side, and the dive platform is damaged. You rented the Blue Shark to this man 3 days ago. My son went out on that boat and never came back. Now you can talk to me or you can talk to the FBI when they seize your vessel as evidence in a homicide investigation." Rick swallowed hard. The color drained from his sunburned face. "Homicide, look, man. He told me it was an accident. He said the guy panicked and drowned. He said I repeated. So you remember him now?" Rick slumped in his chair. "Yeah, I remember him. He was a high roller, showed up with a wad of cash. He wanted to take the boat out alone. No captain, no crew. And what else did he want?" Kendra pressed. Rick looked at the stack of bills on his desk, then back at us. "He offered me $5,000 extra. Cash. Up front. All I had to do was pull the fuse on the main GPS tracker. He said he had a secret fishing spot and didn't want anyone stealing his coordinates. I figured, what's the harm? It's just a tracker." I felt a cold fury rising in my chest. Jared had paid $5,000 to make my son disappear off the grid. It was premeditated. It was cold-blooded. "So there is no record of where they went," Kendra said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Rick started to nod, but I cut him off. I reached into my briefcase. I did not pull out a subpoena. I pulled out a thick envelope containing $10,000 in $100 bills. I dropped it on the desk. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "The GPS fuse only disables the dashboard plotter," I said, looking Rick dead in the eye. "But that boat is equipped with twin Yamaha 300 horsepower engines. Those engines have an internal command link system. They record everything. RPM, water temperature, fuel burn, and yes, GPS location. It is a backup black box designed for maintenance. You have the data card in the maintenance locker. I know you do because you need it for the warranty." Rick looked at the envelope. He looked at me. He realized he was not dealing with a grieving father, but a man who knew his business better than he did. $10,000, he whispered. "For the data card," I said. "And for your silence. If you call Jared, if you tell him we were here, I will make sure you lose your captain's license and your freedom." Rick opened the top drawer of his desk. His hands were shaking as he pulled out a small waterproof memory card case. He slid it across the desk toward me. "I haven't wiped it yet," he muttered. "It's all there." I took the card. It was a tiny piece of plastic no bigger than a fingernail, but it held the coordinates of my son's murder. I turned and walked out of the shack without saying another word. We had the map. Now we just needed to follow the trail to the grave. The laptop screen illuminated the dark interior of the Jeep, casting long shadows across Kendra's face. I did not need a degree in marine navigation to see the lie. The digital map told a story that was as clear as a confession. The red line tracking the Blue Shark movement did not head toward the safe, shallow reefs of Molokini Crater, where tourists go to look at turtles. It headed straight into open water past the continental shelf, stopping dead at a set of coordinates that made my stomach turn. 20 degrees north, 156 degrees west. Local sailors call it the Devil's Crack. It is a volcanic fissure that drops 2,000 feet into absolute darkness. It is a place known for unpredictable down currents and aggressive tiger sharks. It is strictly a no-dive zone marked on every chart with red warning symbols. Bennett was a cautious man. He checked his equipment 3 times before entering a swimming pool. He would never, under any circumstances, willingly enter that water. He did not go there to look at fish. He was taken there to be disposed of. The GPS data showed the boat idled at that location for 45 minutes. That was long enough to fake a drowning. That was long enough to weigh down a body and push it over the edge. Kendra looked at the screen and swore softly. She knew what those coordinates meant. If they dropped him there, she said, her voice tight, the current would have taken him miles away by now. Or worse, he is wedged in the lava tubes. The pressure down there is crushing. I shook my head. No. The current at that depth pushes inland this time of year. It pushes into the underwater caves. He is still down there, waiting. But we cannot get him with standard scuba gear. We need professionals. We need men who are not afraid of the dark. I reached for my phone again. This time I was not calling a lawyer or a bureaucrat. I was calling a ghost from my past. Captain Mack was a salvage expert I had defended 20 years ago when a recovery operation went wrong and the insurance company tried to bury him under lawsuits. He owed me his license, his boat, and his freedom. He answered on the first ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I was in Maui. I told him I needed the heavy gear. Rebreathers, side scan sonar, lift bags, and I needed it tonight off the books. He did not ask why. He just asked where. When I met him an hour later at a dimly lit bar near the harbor, he looked older, his face weathered like old leather, but his grip was still iron. He did not look at the tourists dancing near the jukebox. He looked only at me. I slid a thick envelope across the sticky table. $20,000 for the fuel and the crew, I said. Another $50,000 when we bring him up. And Mac's silence is expensive, but I am paying premium rates. Mac looked at the money, then he looked at the map I had printed out. He tapped the spot marked Devil's Crack with a calloused finger. "This is a graveyard, Conrad," he rumbled. "Good men have gone down there and never come up. But if your boy is there, we will find him." "We dive at dawn," I said, standing up. I walked out into the night air. The pieces were falling into place. Monica thought the ocean was an infinite void that kept secrets forever. She forgot that for men like Mac and me, the ocean is just another office and we know exactly how to open the filing cabinets. Tomorrow the sea would give up its dead. The road to Hana is not just a highway. It is a snake of asphalt coiling through the jungle with 600 hairpin turns and 59 one-lane bridges. At night, without streetlights, it is a death trap. I was navigating turn number 40, the jungle canopy blocking out the moon, when I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. They were high, bright, and blinding LED bars, the kind used by hunters. They were too close. I tapped my brakes, a polite signal to back off. The truck did not slow down. It surged forward, the chrome grille filling my rear window like the jaws of a beast. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text from Kendra. "He is on the island. Monica panicked when you didn't check into the clinic. She tracked your credit card at the airport bar." I did not need the text to know who was behind me. It was Jared. He had flown back to finish what the ocean had failed to do. He was not here to talk. He was here to ensure that the only witness to his crime joined my son at the bottom of the Pacific. I downshifted the engine of the rental Jeep, whining in protest. I was 72, but I learned to drive in Boston winters on ice-slicked roads. This was just physics. I hugged the inside of the curve, feeling the tires fight for grip on the damp pavement. The truck behind me roared its engine, turning the silence of the rainforest into a soundtrack of violence. He rammed my bumper. The impact snapped my head back, sending a jolt of pain down my spine. Metal crunched. Glass shattered. He was trying to push me off the cliff edge on the left, down into the black void, where the surf crashed against the rocks hundreds of feet below. I saw the sign for a one-lane bridge approaching. This was my only chance. If he pinned me on the bridge, I was dead. I slammed on the accelerator, feigning a loss of control. The back end of the Jeep slid out. Jared took the bait. He floored it, trying to pull alongside me to pit maneuver me into the ravine. Just as his front bumper drew level with my rear wheel, I slammed on the brakes and ripped the steering wheel hard to the right. The sudden deceleration caught him off guard. His heavy truck carried its momentum, shooting past me like a missile. He swerved to avoid hitting the bridge abutment, his tires screaming smoke billowing from the wheel wells. He fishtailed wildly, scraping the concrete barrier, sparks flying into the night air. I did not wait to see if he recovered. I spun the wheel, reversing into a hidden cane haul road that Kendra had pointed out on the map earlier. I killed the lights. I sat in the darkness, heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the angry roar of his engine as he sped off down the highway searching for a ghost. He thought he was the hunter. He thought I was just a frightened old man running for his life. He was wrong. I was not running away. I was leading him into deep water. I waited until his taillights disappeared around the next bend. Then I put the Jeep in gear. The dive boat was waiting, and now I knew exactly how desperate they were. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when we reached the coordinates. The ocean at the Devil's Crack was a deep, bruising purple, churning with the kind of energy that makes seasoned sailors nervous. Captain Mack cut the engines of his salvage vessel, allowing us to drift over the spot where the digital ghost of the Blue Shark had lingered for 45 minutes. The silence should have been heavy, broken only by the clanking of oxygen tanks and the hiss of regulators being tested. Instead, it was shattered by a sound I knew all too well. The high-pitched whine of racing engines approached from the east. I looked through my binoculars. It was a white center console boat skipping over the waves like a stone, heading straight for us on a collision course. It was Jared. He had not given up after our dance on the highway. He was doubling down. "Mac, brace for impact," I shouted, gripping the rail. Jared did not ram us. He was smarter than that. He knew a collision would leave paint transfer and debris. Instead, he cut the wheel hard at the last second, sending his boat into a tight, aggressive circle around us. The wake hit us broadside. Our heavy steel hull groaned as it rolled violently in the artificial swell. On the back deck, the divers stumbled. A heavy tank rack broke loose, sliding across the wet metal and slamming into the gunnel. "He is trying to capsize us," Kendra yelled, holding onto the cabin door. "Or at least stop us from putting divers in the water." Jared roared past again, closer this time. I could see his face. He was wearing mirrored sunglasses and a grin that was pure adrenaline and madness. He shouted something lost to the wind, pointing at the open ocean, signaling us to leave. He was playing a dangerous game of chicken betting that a crew of old salvage dogs would be intimidated by a young man with a fast boat. I am not intimidated. I walked calmly to the emergency locker located next to the helm. I pulled out a heavy orange pistol. It was a 12-gauge Orion flare launcher. Standard safety equipment on any vessel, but in the right hands, it is a formidable deterrent. I stepped out onto the port wing of the bridge. I waited. Jared was coming around for a third pass, cutting across our bow to swamp us with his prop wash. He was 50 yards out. 40. 30. I raised the flare gun. I did not aim for the sky. I aimed for the water 10 feet in front of his bow. I pulled the trigger. The recoil kicked against my palm. A brilliant magnesium red star streaked through the air, hissing like an angry dragon. It slammed into the water right in front of Jared's path, exploding in a cloud of blinding red smoke and boiling steam. Jared swerved instinctively. His boat bucked violently as it hit its own wake, the engines screaming as the props cavitated. He fought the wheel, nearly throwing himself overboard. He looked back at me, his face pale beneath the tan. I reloaded the gun, locking the barrel with a metallic snap that echoed across the water. I raised it again, aiming directly at his windshield this time. By the power vested in me by the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, I shouted, my voice carrying over the idle of the engines. "I declare you a hostile vessel. The next one goes through your hull." Jared did not call my bluff. He slammed his throttle forward, peeling away toward the south, leaving a trail of white water and defeat in his wake. "Put them in the water, Mac," I said, lowering the gun. We have a narrow window before he calls his friends or the Coast Guard with a fake distress signal. The divers nodded. They had seen enough. They rolled backward off the platform, disappearing into the dark water, to find the truth my son died to protect. I stood watch on the deck, the flare gun still warm in my hand, daring Jared to come back. The heavy steel dive platform rattled as the two men stepped off the back of the boat. They did not splash like tourists. They slipped beneath the surface with the heavy, calculated grace of predators entering their natural element. I stood in the wheelhouse, my eyes glued to the bank of monitors Mac had set up. The live feed from the divers' headlamps turned the screen into a swirling vortex of blue and black. For the first 10 minutes, there was only the rhythmic sound of their breathing over the comm system, a harsh mechanical rasp that echoed in the silent cabin. "We are passing 100 feet," the lead diver, a man named Miller, reported. His voice was distorted but calm. "Approaching the shelf. The current is strong here. Visibility is less than 10 feet. I gripped the edge of the console until my knuckles turned white. Down there in the crushing dark lay the answer to the question that had been haunting me. I watched the depth gauge on the screen tick lower. 120. 130. They were entering the death zone, the place where nitrogen narcosis starts to mess with a man's mind, the place where mistakes are fatal. "I see debris," Miller said suddenly. The camera jerked to the left. A beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating a jagged section of the reef wall. "What is it?" Mac barked into the microphone. Miller swam closer. His gloved hand reached out, brushing aside a fan of black coral. Caught in the sharp branches was a piece of rubber tubing. It was yellow and black. "It is a high-pressure hose," Miller said. "From a regulator." I leaned closer to the screen. "Is it torn?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Did a shark bite it?" Miller pulled the hose free and held the end up to the camera lens. The image was grainy, but the edge of the rubber was unmistakable. It was perfectly flat. "Negative," Miller said. "This was not a shark. This was cut with a knife. A serrated blade." The cabin went silent. A cut hose meant only one thing. It was not an equipment failure. It was an execution. Someone had slashed Bennett's air supply while he was underwater. "Keep looking," I whispered. Miller moved along the reef, his fins kicking up clouds of silt. Then a flash of silver caught the light. It was wedged deep into a crevice, as if someone had shoved it there in a final desperate act of preservation. "I have an object," Miller said. "It looks like—" "Yes. It is a wrist computer." He pried it loose. It was a Suunto D5 heavy titanium with a scratched bezel. I knew that watch. I had given it to Bennett for his 40th birthday. It was the most advanced dive computer on the market, capable of recording every breath, every depth change, and every second of a dive. "Is it intact?" I asked. "The screen is cracked, but the housing looks sealed," Miller replied. He turned it over. The strap was broken, the pin bent outward. Bennett had ripped it off his own wrist before he died and jammed it into the rock. He knew. In those final terrifying seconds, my son knew he was being murdered, and he left the only witness that could speak for him. "Bring it up," Mac ordered, "and handle it like it is made of glass." As I watched the divers begin their slow ascent, I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 days. Bennett had not just died. He had fought. He had left me a black box. Monica thought she had buried him in the deepest grave on Earth, but she forgot that even the ocean eventually gives up its secrets. The watch was coming to the surface, and with it the countdown to her destruction had officially begun. The salt water was still dripping from the device when Mac handed it to me. It felt heavy in my palm, colder than the air, like a stone pulled from a tomb. This small circle of titanium and glass was the only witness to my son's final moments. I did not wipe it off. I carried it into the wheelhouse where Kendra had set up her field laptop. The air in the cabin was thick with diesel fumes and tension. No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the boat's generator and the frantic beating of my own heart. I plugged the connection cable into the side of the watch. My hands, usually steady in the courtroom, trembled slightly as I initiated the data transfer. The screen flickered. A progress bar appeared. Loading dive log number 412. November 12th, 2:30 p.m. We stared at the screen as the graph materialized. It was a series of jagged lines representing depth tank pressure and heart rate. To a layman, it was just data. To me, it was a horror movie playing out in real time. Look at the profile, I said, pointing to the blue line. For the first 30 minutes, it is a textbook dive. Depth is steady at 60 feet. Breathing rate is calm. He was looking at fish. He was relaxed. Then, at minute 32, everything changed. Kendra gasped. The red line representing heart rate spiked vertically. It went from 70 beats per minute to 180 in 3 seconds. That is panic. That is the fight or flight response kicking in instantly. And look at the green line, Mac whispered, leaning in closer. Tank pressure. It does not drop gradually like it would if a hose burst. It flatlines. It goes from 2,000 psi to 0 instantly. I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. There is only one way tank pressure drops that fast without an explosion. Someone reached behind him and closed the valve. Someone shut off his air. Bennett was an expert diver. If his air was cut, he would have reached for his octo, his backup regulator, or he would have dropped his weights and made an emergency ascent. But the depth chart showed the opposite. He did not go up, I said, my voice barely audible. He went down. The blue depth line plummeted. 60 feet, 80 feet, 100 feet. It was a rapid, uncontrolled descent. He was fighting, I said, tracing the erratic spikes in the motion sensor data. He was trying to swim up, but something was pulling him down. Someone was holding him, or someone had clipped a heavy weight to his belt. The data ended abruptly at 150 feet. The watch had been ripped off and jammed into the rocks, but the story was complete. Bennett did not panic and drown. He was ambushed. He was suffocated. And then he was dragged into the dark. I looked at the screen at the digital signature of my son's murder. I did not feel grief in that moment. I felt a clarity so sharp it cut like a knife. This was not negligence. This was not a prank gone wrong. It was a calculated execution. I pulled the USB drive from the computer. I had the weapon. I had the motive. And now, thanks to the cold, impartial memory of a machine, I had the proof. We are done here, I told Mac. Take us back. I have a court date to prepare for. I stood on the rolling deck of the salvage boat looking down into the indigo water. We had the watch. We had the digital proof of the murder. But we did not have Bennett. Mac was already suiting up, preparing a second team to go deeper to scour the bottom for the body. He was a man of action, and he wanted to finish the job. I put a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. The charts spread out on the table told me a different story, a story of physics and fluid dynamics that I had studied for 40 years. Do not send them down, Mac, I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. He is not on the bottom. Mac looked at me confused. The weight belt would have taken him straight down Conrad. He has to be there. I shook my head and pointed to the topographic map on the screen. Look at the contour lines. At 200 feet, the Devil's Crack intersects with a subsurface lava tube system. The current here is not static. It is a siphon. It pulls everything into the mountain, not away from it. Jared thought he was dropping Bennett into an abyss. He actually dropped him into a natural cold storage locker. I traced the line of the underwater current with my finger. If he was weighed down with concrete blocks, as I suspect, the drag would have pulled him right into the mouth of that cave. He is there, preserved by the cold water, hidden from the sharks, and waiting. Then let us go get him, Max said, reaching for his helmet. No, I said sharply. We leave him. The crew stared at me in horror. They thought I was heartless. They did not understand that I was thinking like a prosecutor, not a father. If we bring him up now, I explained, forcing the emotion out of my voice, we break the chain of custody. Monica's defense team will argue that we planted the evidence. They will say we cut the hose. They will say we staged the scene. For this to stick, for her to go to prison for life, the FBI dive team has to be the one to find him. They need to photograph the knots Jared tied. They need to document the specific brand of concrete blocks he used. I looked back at the water, fighting the urge to jump in and hold my son one last time. Leaving him there was the hardest thing I have ever done. It felt like abandoning him all over again. But I knew Bennett would understand. He was a man of logic. He would want justice, not just a funeral. Mark the coordinates, I told Kendra. Encrypt the data. Send it directly to the Honolulu field office of the FBI with a priority flag for maritime homicide. But tell them to wait for my signal. Why wait? Kendra asked. Because if they find the body today, Monica will know before I get back to Boston, I said, turning away from the rail. She will run. She has money now. She can disappear to a non-extradition country in 12 hours. I need her to feel safe. I need her to think she has won. I need to be standing in front of her when the handcuffs click. I walked to the helm and signaled the captain to turn the boat around. We are going back to the airport, I said. I have a flight to catch. The small fish is caught. Now I am going home to gut the shark. The transition from the tropical heat of Maui to the freezing drizzle of Boston was jarring, but it was necessary. The cold helped me freeze my emotions again. I could not afford to be the man who had stood on the deck of the salvage boat, commanding a crew and wielding a flare gun. To finish this, I had to become the ghost again. I had to become the pathetic, trembling old man that Monica believed she had successfully exiled to Florida. I took a taxi to a thrift store in South Boston before heading home. I bought a faded cardigan that smelled of mothballs and a pair of trousers that were slightly too short. I needed to look like I had shrunk, like the Florida sun had dried me out rather than healed me. I discarded the confident stride I had rediscovered in Hawaii. I forced my spine to curve. I practiced the tremor in my right hand until my muscles ached. By the time I walked up the service driveway of the Sullivan estate, dragging my suitcase through the mud, I was fully back in character. The guest house was exactly as I had left it. Cold, damp. The smell of chlorine from the pool filter room seeped through the thin walls. I did not unpack. I immediately went to work securing the cargo I had brought back. The hard drive containing the GPS data and the blackened, scratched Suunto dive computer were not things I could leave in a drawer. I pried up a loose floorboard under the sink, a hiding spot I had used 40 years ago to hide Christmas presents from Bennett. I wrapped the evidence in plastic and lowered it into the dark crawl space. It was fitting. The truth about my son was buried in the foundation of the home he grew up in. I waited until morning to make my presence known. I watched the main house from behind the curtains. At 9 o'clock, I saw Monica's Mercedes pull into the driveway. She was wearing a new fur coat, carrying shopping bags from Newbury Street. She looked radiant. She looked rich. She looked like a woman who had forgotten she ever had a husband. I timed my exit perfectly. As she walked toward the back door, I shuffled out of the shed, leaning heavily on my cane. I let out a dry, hacking cough. Monica turned, startled. Her face fell the moment she saw me. The disgust was immediate and visceral. "You are back early," she said, not bothering to hide her disappointment. "I thought the clinic program was for 6 weeks. I ran out of money, Monica." I lied, my voice quavering. The insurance would not cover the extended therapy. And I missed home. "Home," she laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "This isn't your home anymore, Conrad. It is my house. But I suppose since you are here, you can rake the leaves. The driveway is a mess." She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask about the treatment. She certainly did not suspect that while she was buying shoes, I was pulling her secrets from the bottom of the ocean. She tossed her hair and walked inside, slamming the door against the cold. I stood there in the wind, clutching my cane. A younger version of me would have been insulted. But the man I was today just smiled internally. Her arrogance was her blindfold. She thought I was a broken old man returning to beg for shelter. She had no idea that I was a Trojan horse, and the walls of her fortress were already burning down. I picked up the rake. I would clean her driveway. I would play the part, because every leaf I raked was just counting down the seconds until I took everything she had. Just when I thought I had seen the absolute depths of Monica's depravity, she found a shovel and dug deeper. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the rain was lashing against the windows of the manor. I was in the hallway polishing the wainscoting because she had complained about dust motes. She called me into the living room with a voice that was uncharacteristically soft, almost musical. She was sitting by the fire, wrapping her hands around a cup of herbal tea, playing the picture of a fragile, expectant mother. She patted the spot on the sofa next to her. For a moment, she looked so convincing that I almost forgot she was a sociopath who had hired a hitman to drown my son. "Conrad," she said, her eyes glistening with what looked like genuine tears, "I have received a miracle. In the midst of all this darkness, Bennett left us a gift." She reached into a folder on her lap and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. The first was a glossy black and white ultrasound image showing a tiny grainy bean shape. The second was a document from a genetic testing lab. "I am pregnant," she whispered, and I was so scared, so worried it might not be his, that I had a prenatal paternity test done. "It is a match, Conrad. It is Bennett's baby. You are going to be a grandfather." I took the papers. My hands shook, but not from the palsy I was faking. They shook with rage. The ultrasound looked generic, the kind you can download from a stock image website for $5. The DNA report was even worse. It claimed a 99.9% probability of paternity. It was a flawless forgery, likely created on the same laptop she used to forge the will. But the real knife twist came next. She placed a hand on her flat stomach and sighed. "I know Bennett left me the house and the cash," she said, watching my face carefully. "But raising a child is expensive. The private schools, the nannies, the Ivy League tuition. I know you are the trustee of the Sullivan Family Trust. That money was meant for Bennett's heirs. Since I am carrying the sole heir, I think it is time we transfer the trust management to me, for the baby's sake." I stared at the paper. The Sullivan Family Trust held $25 million. It was the only asset I still legally controlled, the only thing she hadn't touched. She didn't want a baby. She wanted the last piece of the pie. She was using a non-existent child to pick the lock of the family vault. I looked up at her, forcing a smile through the bile rising in my throat. "This is wonderful news, Monica," I said, my voice cracking with feigned emotion. A true miracle. And it was a miracle, but not the kind she thought. It was a miracle of stupidity. You see, Monica had made one critical error. She did not know family history. She did not know that when Bennett was 14 years old, he contracted a severe case of mumps. The fever nearly killed him, and the complications left him completely, irrevocably sterile. We had cried together in the doctor's office when he found out he would never father children. He had never told Monica. He was too ashamed. So as I held the fake DNA test that proved my sterile son had fathered a child from beyond the grave, I knew I had her. She had just handed me the final nail for her coffin. "I will call the bank tomorrow," I told her, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. "The baby deserves everything." She smiled, a predatory grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. She thought she had won the jackpot. She didn't realize she had just signed a confession to fraud, and she had done it while I was recording every word. I woke up to the sound of news helicopters chopping the air above the estate. It was a rhythmic thumping noise that vibrated the loose window panes of the guest shed. I did not need to turn on the television to know what was happening. Monica had grown impatient. Despite my promise to call the bank, she had decided that a handshake deal with a senile old man was not secure enough. She wanted a court order, and to get it, she had decided to try me in the court of public opinion first. I walked to the gate to pick up the morning paper. The headline of the Boston Globe was printed in font usually reserved for declarations of war. Cruel grandfather hoards fortune from unborn heir. Below it was a photo of me taken with a telephoto lens while I was raking leaves yesterday. I looked disheveled, angry, and confused. Beside it was a studio portrait of Monica looking angelic in white, clutching her stomach with a protective desperation. The article was a masterpiece of fiction. It quoted an anonymous source close to the family, claiming that I had threatened to disown the child, that I was refusing to pay for medical care, and that the stress was endangering the pregnancy. She was not just stealing my money. She was stealing my name. She was painting me as a monster to ensure that when she finally kicked me to the curb, the world would cheer her on. An hour later, a process server arrived. He shoved a thick envelope into my chest. It was an emergency motion filed in the probate and family court. Monica was requesting the immediate dissolution of the Sullivan Family Trust and the disbursement of $20 million in liquid assets to her for prenatal security and lifestyle maintenance. She claimed that my mental state was deteriorating, making me unfit to act as a trustee. She argued that the baby the miracle heir required had specialized medical attention that only millions of dollars could buy. I read the affidavit in the dim light of the shed. It was bold, it was aggressive, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. By filing this motion, Monica had moved her lies from the dinner table to the legal record. Lying to a father-in-law is a sin. Lying to a judge in a sworn affidavit to secure funds is a felony. It is perjury. It is wire fraud. It is attempted grand larceny. She was rushing. That was her mistake. Greed makes people sloppy. She wanted the cash before the baby bump failed to materialize or before she had to fake a miscarriage. She needed the money now. I watched the reporters camped out at the main gate, their cameras pointed at the house like rifles. They wanted a statement. They wanted the angry old miser to come out and scream. I did not give them the satisfaction. I went back inside and made a cup of tea. I let the phone ring. I let the voicemail fill up with hate mail from strangers who believed the sob story of the grieving widow. Let them write their articles. Let them drag my reputation through the mud. Every word she spoke to the press, every document she filed with the court, was just another bar in the cell I was building for her. She wanted a day in court to humiliate me. I would give it to her, and it would be the last day of freedom she ever saw. The cameras were waiting. I knew exactly where they were hiding. The telephoto lenses poking through the rhododendrons at the edge of the property were hungry for a villain, but I was about to give them a tragedy instead. I walked up the marble steps to the veranda where Monica was holding court. She was wearing a white cashmere shawl draped purposefully to highlight her stomach, looking every bit the grieving widow protecting her unborn legacy. She saw me coming and stiffened, but she did not retreat inside. She wanted the world to see this confrontation. She wanted the footage of the angry patriarch harassing the pregnant mother. I was counting on it. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. I let my shoulders slump forward, curving my spine into a question mark of defeat. I leaned heavily on my cane until my knuckles turned white. I looked up at her, letting the raw gray daylight expose every wrinkle, every sign of my supposed physical collapse. Monica. I called out, my voice loud enough for the directional microphones at the gate to pick up, but shaking with manufactured emotion. Please, I just want to make peace. I cannot fight you anymore. She looked down at me with cold amusement masked as fear. She took a sip of her iced tea, checking her angles to make sure the light was hitting her face correctly. Go away, Conrad, she said, her voice pitched high and trembling. You are upsetting me. You are bad for the baby. The stress is too much. This was the moment. I dropped my cane. It clattered loudly on the stone pavers. I lowered myself slowly, painfully wincing, as my knees hit the hard concrete. I clasped my hands together in front of my chest. I was begging. To the cameras, it was a pitiful display of a broken man pleading with the only family he had left. To me, it was the final calibration of a trap. "I will sign the papers." I sobbed, forcing tears to stream down my face. "I will give you the trust fund. I will give you the 20 million. I do not care about the money. Just promise me one thing. Promise me I can see my grandchild. Promise me I can hold Bennett's baby just once when it is born. I will disappear after that. Please, Monica. It is all I have left of him." Monica stepped down one step. She looked around to ensure the security guards were close, then she leaned over the railing, her face close to mine. She thought she was whispering, but the high-fidelity recorder taped to my chest caught every syllable with crystal clarity. "You really are pathetic," she hissed, dropping the act for just a second. "Do you think I want your old dying energy around my child? You are a relic, Conrad. You are the past. This baby is my future. And I am going to make sure this child never hears your name. By the time he is old enough to speak, he won't even know you existed. I will burn every photo. I will erase you from history. You will die alone in that shed, and this baby will grow up spending your money without ever knowing who you were. Now get off my property before I call the police to drag you away." She straightened up, smoothing her dress, playing the victim again for the cameras. I stayed on my knees for a moment longer, head bowed. I was not praying. I was smiling into the concrete. She had just admitted to malicious intent. She had just displayed heartless cruelty to a global audience, and best of all, she had fought so hard to keep me away from a child that I knew with absolute scientific certainty did not exist. I slowly picked up my cane and limped away, leaving her to bask in her momentary victory, unaware that she had just starred in the opening scene of her own destruction. The house was quiet, a rare state of grace for a property that had become a circus of media vans and lawyers. Monica had left at 10 in the morning, dressed in her best victim attire, heading to a strategy lunch with her publicist. She left the back door unlocked for the cleaning service she had hurriedly hired after firing the loyal staff. She was too cheap to pay for a reputable agency, so she booked a budget crew online. She did not know that the cleaning company was a shell corporation registered to Kendra's private investigation firm, and the maid arriving in the battered white van was not there to scrub floors. I watched from the dusty window of the garden shed as Kendra stepped out of the van. She was unrecognizable. Her sharp investigator's eyes were hidden behind thick glasses, and her athletic frame was concealed beneath a shapeless blue uniform. She carried a bucket of cleaning supplies, but inside that bucket were evidence bags and sterile tweezers. She walked into the main house with the weary slump of a minimum wage worker invisible and ignored by the security guard playing games on his phone at the gate. I switched on the audio feed from the bug I had planted in the kitchen. I heard Kendra moving quickly. She did not waste time dusting the living room. She went straight up the grand staircase to the master suite. This was the room I had built for my wife, the room where Bennett had slept. Now it was the headquarters of the occupation. Through the hidden camera in the hallway, I saw her slip into the bathroom. This was where the biological truth lay. Monica was careful with documents, but she was careless with her own body. People always are. They leave pieces of themselves everywhere they go. Kendra moved to the vanity. The silver hairbrush that once belonged to Bennett's mother was sitting there tangled with long, dark strands of hair. Monica's hair. Kendra pulled a clump free with her tweezers, sealing it instantly in a plastic bag. Then she turned to the other side of the sink. Jared's side. His razor was sitting in a pool of soapy water. His comb was full of sun-bleached sandy hair. Kendra bagged them both. We now had the genetic markers for the mother and the alleged lover, but we needed the connection. We needed to prove that the miracle baby was not a gift from my dead son, but a byproduct of their affair. Kendra knelt down by the trash can. It is a glamorous job investigating murder until you find yourself digging through a bathroom bin for used tissues and cotton swabs. She found what we needed near the bottom: discarded packaging from a prenatal test kit and biological waste that would contain the fetal DNA markers Monica was trying to hide. She was out of the room in 4 minutes. She spent the next hour actually cleaning the kitchen to maintain her cover, scrubbing away the coffee stains Monica had left. When she walked back to her van, she paused near the shed, pretending to tie her shoe. She slipped a small, heavy envelope under the door. I waited until the van's taillights disappeared down the driveway before I picked it up. I held the package in my hands. It weighed nothing, yet it carried the weight of a life sentence. I had the samples. I had the lab ready in Boston to run the comparison on an expedited rush. Monica claimed she had science on her side. She claimed a 99% match to Bennett. I was about to prove that science does not lie, but people do. By tomorrow evening, I would have a piece of paper that proved the only thing Bennett had given her was a motive, and the baby she was carrying belonged to the man who helped her kill him. I waited until the house was dark, and the rhythm of the evening settled into a quiet hum. I had replaced the light bulb in the master bedroom earlier that day, during the brief window when the cleaning crew was distracting the security guard. It was not a standard bulb. Inside the base was a high-fidelity transmitter, a piece of surveillance technology that drew power directly from the lamp's socket. It was invisible, untraceable, and it had a range that reached perfectly to my receiver in the garden shed. I sat at my makeshift desk, the headphones pressing tight against my ears, blocking out the sound of the rain and the wind. I was not listening to music. I was listening to the silence of the room where my son used to sleep. Then the door opened. I heard the heavy footsteps of Jared and the lighter clicking heels of Monica. They were laughing. It was the sound of a couple who had just pulled off the heist of the century. I poured myself a drink, Jared said. The sound of liquid hitting crystal was crisp and clear. To you, babe. You were incredible today. When he got on his knees, I almost lost it. I thought he was going to have a heart attack right there on the pavement. Monica giggled, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was so easy, she said. He is desperate, Jared. He is lonely and old, and he thinks he can buy his way back into a family that does not exist. Did you see his face when I talked about the baby? He looked like a kicked puppy. He actually believes it is Bennett's miracle child. I adjusted the volume, ensuring the recorder was capturing every frequency. This was it. This was the moment the mask slipped off completely. He bought the pregnancy hook, line, and sinker, Jared continued. But are you sure the trust transfer will go through fast enough? I don't want to stick around here. This house gives me the creeps. Relax, Monica replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The judge is fast-tracking the emergency motion. The moment the media ran that story about him hoarding the money, public pressure forced the court's hand. We should have the $20 million in the offshore account by Friday. Once the wire clears, we are gone. And the old man, Jared asked. He can rot in that shed for all I care, Monica said, cold and dismissive. Or maybe the shock of us disappearing will finally finish him off. We will be in the Maldives before he even realizes the account is empty. And as for this baby, well, we can deal with that problem when we get to a country that does not ask too many questions. I stopped the recording. I saved the file to 3 separate hard drives. I sat back in my chair, staring at the spinning tape icon on the screen. They were celebrating a victory that had already been annulled. They were toasting to a future that would never happen. They thought they were discussing a vacation. In reality, they had just dictated their own prison sentences. I took off the headphones and looked out the window at the single light burning in the master bedroom. Sleep well, Monica. Enjoy the champagne. Because tomorrow, the hangover is going to be lethal. The Suffolk County Probate Court smells of old wood floor wax and the stale sweat of broken families. It is a room designed to intimidate with its high ceilings and portraits of dead judges looking down in judgment. I sat at the defendant's table alone. I had no team of paralegals, no junior associates whispering in my ear. I had only my cane and a single thin file folder placed neatly in front of me. To the gallery filled with reporters and curious onlookers, I looked like a man awaiting his execution. To Monica, who sat across the aisle surrounded by a phalanx of high-priced attorneys, I looked like an inconvenience that was about to be removed. Her lead counsel was Richard Sterling, the son of my former family lawyer. He was young, ambitious, and wearing a suit that cost more than the average car. He stood up to address the court, exuding the kind of arrogance that only comes from thinking your opponent is already dead. He did not treat me with the professional courtesy due to a senior member of the bar. He treated me like a patient. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice smooth and practiced. "We take no pleasure in bringing this motion. Mr. Sullivan is a man who has suffered a terrible tragedy. But it is the position of my client that this grief has accelerated a cognitive decline that was already in progress. We are not here to punish a grandfather. We are here to protect the financial future of his unborn grandchild from a trustee who is no longer tethered to reality." He projected images onto the courtroom screens. There I was wearing the dirty gardener's jumpsuit, looking disheveled. There was the video of me on my knees in the driveway, weeping and begging. There was a sworn affidavit from the clinic in Florida, which I had never actually visited, claiming I had sought help for advanced dementia. It was a lie, but Richard sold it with conviction. He painted a portrait of a man who was erratic, emotionally unstable, and incompetent. "Mr. Sullivan is hoarding assets," Richard thundered, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "He has refused to release funds for essential prenatal care. He is living in a shed. He is burying items in the garden. These are not the actions of a sound mind. These are the actions of a man who needs a guardian, not a checkbook." I sat perfectly still. I did not object. I did not interrupt. In a normal trial, my silence would be professional suicide. But this was not a normal trial. I was letting Richard overextend himself. I was letting him put statements on the record that were demonstrably false. Every time he called me senile, he was digging the hole deeper. Every time Monica nodded in agreement, she was perjuring herself by proxy. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Halloway, looked at me over her spectacles. She saw a frail old man staring at his hands. She did not see the shark waiting in the deep water. "Mr. Sullivan," she asked, her voice softened by pity, "do you have any response to these allegations? Do you have counsel present?" I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the table. I let my hand tremble just enough for the back row to see. "No, Your Honor," I whispered, my voice raspy. "I did not hire a lawyer. I just want to do the right thing. If everyone says I am sick, maybe I am. I just want my son's baby to be safe." I sat back down. Richard smirked. He exchanged a high five with his co-counsel under the table. Monica let out a breath she had been holding, her shoulders relaxing. They had expected a fight. They had prepared for a war. Instead, they got a surrender. They thought the game was over. They had no idea that by refusing to fight the small battle, I had just maneuvered them into the kill zone for the war that really mattered. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the steel jaws were about to snap shut. Justice Halloway struck her gavel against the wood block with a sound that signaled a 15-minute recess. The noise echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, marking the end of the opening act. To the observers in the gallery, the play was over. The tragic hero had fallen and the villain had triumphed. My attorney, or rather the empty chair where an attorney should have been, was the ultimate symbol of my defeat. Richard Sterling was already standing up, buttoning his expensive Italian jacket, laughing at a joke his junior associate had whispered. They were high-fiving with their eyes. They believed they had just secured the easiest $20 million judgment in the history of the probate court. I remained seated. I kept my head down, my hands folded on the table, maintaining the illusion of the broken, confused grandfather. I felt a presence beside me. It was not a bailiff. It was Monica. She could not resist the urge to gloat. It is the defining characteristic of a narcissist. Winning is not enough for them. They need to stand over the body and twist the knife. She dismissed her lawyers with a wave of her hand and glided over to the defendant's table. She looked radiant, flushed with the thrill of the kill. She placed a manicured hand on my shoulder, a gesture that looked comforting to the room, but felt like a talon digging into my flesh. "You really made this too easy, Conrad," she whispered, leaning down so her lips brushed my ear. Her voice was low, venomous, and stripped of the sweet, victimized tone she had used for the judge. "I almost feel bad for you. Almost. But do not worry. I will pick a nice state facility for you. One with a view of a brick wall. And as for the money, Jared and I are going to burn through it so fast, your head would spin." She squeezed my shoulder one last time, preparing to walk away and accept the congratulations of the press. She expected me to weep. She expected me to beg again. She expected the tremoring hand and the confused eyes. Instead, I reached up and removed her hand from my shoulder. I did not do it with the weak grip of an invalid. I did it with the firm, crushing strength of a man who had hauled lobster traps in his youth. I held her wrist for a second, just long enough to feel her pulse spike. I stopped the shaking in my right hand. I sat up straight, my spine uncoiling, the inches returning to my frame until I was looking her dead in the eye. The fog in my gaze vanished, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of a prosecutor. "Monica," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing the raspy affectation I had worn for weeks. It was the voice of the man who had built this fortune, not the man she thought she was stealing it from. She froze. Her eyes widened, confusion warring with fear. "I was just admiring your outfit." I continued, my tone smooth and conversational. "That navy pinstripe suit is a very bold choice for a defendant. It is very slimming. And I think it is going to coordinate perfectly with the iron bars of the cell you will be sleeping in tonight." She yanked her hand away, as if she had touched a hot stove. She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing, searching for words that would not come. The arrogance drained out of her face, replaced by a dawning horror. She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time she realized that the sheep she had been leading to the slaughter was actually a wolf waiting for her to open the gate. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile and turned my attention back to my file. The recess was over, and so was her life. The bailiff called the room to order, and the noise of the gallery died down to a low, expectant hum. Justice Halloway looked at her watch, clearly impatient. She was ready to sign the order, ready to give Monica the keys to the kingdom and send me to a state facility. Richard Sterling was already capping his expensive fountain pen, a smug grin plastered across his face. He stood up to make his final motion to bury me under a mountain of legal rhetoric and secure his victory fee. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," I said. My voice did not quaver. It did not shake. It rang out through the courtroom with the deep, commanding resonance of a church bell. The room went dead silent. Richard froze halfway out of his chair. The judge blinked, looking over her reading glasses, confused by the sudden change in audio frequency coming from the defense table. I stood up. I did not use the table for support. I did not reach for the cane lying on the floor. I straightened my back, buttoning my cheap thrift store jacket, with a steady hand rising to my full height of 6 feet 2 inches. The trembling, confused old gardener had vanished. In his place stood Conrad Sullivan, the man who had once argued cases before the Supreme Court. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge asked, her brow furrowing as she reassessed the man standing before her. "I am representing myself from this moment forward." "Your Honor," I stated, walking to the center of the room with a confident stride. "And I would like to address the court regarding the matter of this so-called miracle baby." I heard Monica shift in her seat behind me. Her breath hitched. She saw the change. She saw the wolf shedding its sheepskin. I turned to the jury box, though there was no jury addressing the room at large. "I want to tell you about the winter of 1994. Bennett was 12 years old. It was a brutal winter in Boston, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the heat radiating from my son's body. He contracted a severe case of the mumps. It was not the mild childhood illness most people remember. It was a systemic infection. His fever spiked to 105 degrees. For 3 nights, my late wife and I packed him in ice, praying he would not suffer brain damage. We sat by his bed, terrified that we were going to lose him. I paused, letting the gravity of the memory fill the room. I looked directly at Monica. She was pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. She knew she had missed something. She just didn't know what yet. Bennett survived. I continued, my voice softening with genuine sorrow. But the fever took a toll. The complications were severe and specific. He suffered from acute orchitis. When the inflammation finally subsided, the doctors ran tests. They were conclusive. The damage was permanent and total. My son Bennett Sullivan was rendered completely, irrevocably sterile at the age of 12. He could never father a child. We cried about it for weeks. It was his deepest insecurity, a secret he kept from the world. A secret he apparently kept from his wife. I walked back to my table and picked up a sealed, certified envelope. So you see, Your Honor. While I appreciate Ms. Sullivan's claim of a divine gift, biology disagrees. The child she is carrying cannot possibly belong to my son. Which begs the question, whose baby is she trying to use to steal $25 million from this estate? The gasp from the gallery was audible, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the room. Richard Sterling looked at his client, his face a mask of horror. Monica looked like she had been shot. I dropped the envelope on the judge's bench. It was the medical records from Boston Children's Hospital, dated 1994. The first domino had just fallen, and the crash was deafening. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom seemed to seal the air inside, turning the atmosphere thick and suffocating. Conrad sat at the defense table, his hands folded calmly over a manila folder. His lawyer, a man who had spent the last hour sweating through his expensive suit and stammering through objections, reached for a glass of water. Conrad placed a firm hand on the attorney's forearm. The gesture was gentle but possessed the weight of a final decision. He leaned over and whispered a few words that made the lawyer freeze, blink rapidly, and then slowly begin to pack his briefcase. The judge watched the exchange with a furrowed brow, his gavel hovering just inches above the wood. Conrad stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, the motion of a man who was done rushing, done hiding, and done letting others speak for him. He addressed the bench with a voice that was low but carried to the back of the room without a tremor. He informed the court that he would be representing himself from this moment forward. A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery, but Conrad ignored it. He did not look at the jury. He did not look at the judge. He turned his body until he was facing the plaintiff's table directly. He looked at Bennett. For a long moment, the father just studied the son. Bennett shifted in his chair, his arrogance flickering for a second, before he composed his face into a mask of bored indifference. Monica, sitting beside him, smoothed her dress over her visible baby bump, her eyes darting away from Conrad's piercing gaze. Conrad walked to the center of the room. He did not start with legal statutes or arguments about property rights. Instead, he began to speak about a winter 20 years ago. He described a storm that had shut down the entire city, trapping them inside their home. He spoke of a 12-year-old boy burning with a fever so high it felt like radiating heat from a furnace. He recounted the sleepless nights he spent by Bennett's bedside, changing cold compresses every 20 minutes, terrified by the delirium that had taken hold of his child. It was a story of paternal devotion that painted a picture of a bond that seemed unbreakable. The jury leaned in, captivated by the raw vulnerability of a man accused of being a cold-hearted tyrant. Bennett frowned, clearly confused by this trip down memory lane, unable to see the trap being laid beneath the nostalgia. Conrad described the specific illness, It was a severe case of mumps, a childhood ailment that usually passes without incident, but in this case had arrived late and with brutal intensity. He spoke of the doctor's warnings and the long, painful recovery that followed. He recalled holding Bennett's hand when the boy cried from the pain, promising him that they would get through it together, that he would be okay. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter seemed to have paused. Conrad let the memory hang in the air, a testament to the love he had poured into the man who was now trying to destroy him. Then the tone shifted. The warmth drained from Conrad's voice, replaced by the clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. He walked back to his table and picked up a certified medical file. He held it up, not like a weapon, but like a tragedy. He explained that there was a complication from that infection, a complication they had never discussed openly because he wanted to spare his son the embarrassment and the pain. He opened the file. The complication was orchitis severe and bilateral. He read the conclusion from the specialist they had seen 6 months after the fever broke. The diagnosis was absolute and irreversible. The medical term echoed off the walls: azoospermia. Conrad turned to the jury and translated the term with devastating clarity. Bennett was completely sterile. He had been since the age of 12. He had never been able to father a child, and he never would. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a library, but the vacuum of a room where all the oxygen had suddenly been sucked out. Bennett's face drained of all color. He looked at the medical file in his father's hand as if it were a venomous snake. He opened his mouth to object, to scream, to deny it, but the weight of the truth pressed him back into his chair. He knew about the mumps. He knew about the pain. He had just never known the lasting cost, because his father had shielded him from the diagnosis to protect his ego. Conrad did not stop there. He turned his gaze to Monica. She was frozen, her hand instinctively covering her stomach, as if to shield the unborn child from the words filling the room. Conrad spoke gently to her, though his words were fatal to her schemes. He pointed out the biological impossibility of her current condition if Bennett was indeed the father. The pregnancy that they had used as the emotional anchor of their lawsuit, the heir that was supposed to secure their claim to the family estate, was a physical impossibility. Bennett turned slowly to look at his wife. The realization dawned on him with the force of a physical blow. The betrayal he had inflicted on his father was now being mirrored by the betrayal sitting right next to him. But Conrad had one final piece of the puzzle to place. He produced a second document. It was a laboratory report from a private genetics firm. He explained how he had acquired a sample from a discarded coffee cup used by Jared Bennett's best friend and business partner, the man who had been urging them to sue for the estate. Conrad read the results. The DNA markers were a perfect match. The child growing in Monica's womb did not belong to the sterile husband she was manipulating. It belonged to the man who was helping them destroy him. Monica let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, and buried her face in her hands. She did not deny it. She could not. The truth was written in the percentages on the page Conrad held. Bennett stared at her, his entire world fracturing. The arrogance, the greed, the confidence, it all evaporated, leaving behind a man who realized he was not the master of the game but the pawn. He had lost his father, he had lost his inheritance, and in a matter of seconds, he realized he had never even had a wife or a child. Conrad placed the papers on the judge's bench and returned to his seat, sitting in the heavy silence of a justice that had finally arrived. The courtroom was still reeling from the shocking revelation of the paternity test when Conrad turned his back on his son for the last time. He walked slowly to the bailiff and gave a single sharp nod. The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open with a groan that sounded like the lid of a coffin being lifted. 4 men walked in with a synchronized heavy step that commanded absolute silence. 2 of them wore the crisp blue uniforms of the Coast Guard, with gold insignias shining under the court lights. The other two wore the dark, tailored suits and stern expressions that could only belong to federal agents. The air in the room shifted instantly from the heated drama of a civil family feud to the cold and terrifying reality of a criminal investigation. Bennett looked at the men, and his eyes widened in sheer panic. Jared, who had been sitting in the gallery, tried to stand up and slip away unnoticed, but one of the agents simply raised a hand, and a uniformed officer at the door stepped firmly into his path. Conrad returned to his table and picked up a small, heavy object sealed in a clear evidence bag. It was a dive computer, the kind used by deep-sea divers to track depth and nitrogen levels. It looked battered and covered in scratches and salt stains, but the digital screen was intact. Conrad held it up for the jury to see. He explained that everyone believed this watch had been lost at the bottom of the ocean on that fateful trip 3 months ago. They believed it was gone forever, just like they believed Conrad was supposed to have drowned by accident that day. But the ocean has a way of returning things that need to be found. A local fisherman had pulled it up in a net weeks later, and the data inside had been miraculously preserved. Conrad placed the device gently on the judge's bench. He spoke with a voice that was terrifyingly calm and precise. He detailed the data logs that had been extracted by forensic experts. The watch had recorded everything. It recorded the exact time his air supply stopped. It recorded the frantic spike in his heart rate. Most importantly, it recorded the GPS coordinates of the incident. He pointed to a large map that his team had set up on the easel. The coordinates placed the boat exactly 12 miles off the coast. He looked directly at Bennett and Jared. 12 miles out means you are no longer in state waters. You are in international waters, and a crime committed in international waters falls under the jurisdiction of maritime law and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The judge looked at the documents provided by the agents, and his face went pale. He looked at Bennett and then at Jared. The banging of the gavel was not necessary, but he did it anyway to bring the room to order. Conrad announced the charge. It was not negligence. It was not manslaughter. It was attempted premeditated murder. The data showed that his air tank had not malfunctioned. It had been manually closed, and the dive computer showed that another diver had been right next to him at that exact moment. The digital signature of that second diver's equipment matched the serial number of the gear rented by Jared. The federal agents moved in. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the silent room like gunshots. Bennett began to scream that it was a mistake and that he did not know anything, but the agents were already reading him his rights. Jared was dragged from the gallery, his legs giving out beneath him. Conrad stood still and watched them go, his expression unreadable. He had stripped them of their inheritance, their lies, and now their freedom. The trap was finally sprung. The courtroom air was heavy, vibrating with the tension of the arrest. But Conrad was not finished. He walked back to the evidence table and picked up the decorative marble urn that had sat on the mantel of Bennett's home for the last 3 months. It was the urn that Bennett had wept over at the memorial service. The urn that was supposed to contain the last earthly remains of a father he claimed to miss. Conrad held it with a strange mix of reverence and disgust. He turned to the jury, and his voice dropped to a whisper that was louder than a scream. He told them that when he returned from the dead, the first thing he did was secure this urn. He wanted to know what his son had actually burned to put on display. He opened the forensic report and read the findings. The contents were not human ash. There was no calcium signature consistent with a human skeleton. The lab analysis was conclusive and humiliating. The urn contained a mixture of hardwood charcoal and pulverized avian bone. Chicken bones. The gasp from the gallery was audible. Conrad looked at Bennett, who was now handcuffed and slumped in his chair. He asked his son if he had simply swept out his fireplace and raided his kitchen trash to create a prop for his performance. It was the ultimate insult, a final desecration that proved there was never any grief, only a cold, calculated script to secure an inheritance. But Conrad had one final image to show a truth far darker than chicken bones and charcoal. He signaled to the technical team, and the large screens in the courtroom flickered to life. The image was grainy blue and dark. It was underwater footage taken by the Coast Guard recovery team just 48 hours ago. The camera moved through the murky water, illuminating the jagged walls of a deep underwater cave, a place known to local divers as a death trap, a place no recreational diver would ever go. Conrad narrated the scene. He explained that when his air was cut, he didn't just drift. He saw something. He saw Bennett signal to the dive master, a man named Miller, who had mysteriously disappeared the same week Conrad was lost. Bennett had claimed Miller had moved to the islands, but Conrad knew the truth. The camera on the screen pushed forward, the light cutting through the darkness, until it landed on a shape wedged into a crevice of the rock. It was a body. Preserved by the freezing temperatures and the lack of oxygen in the deep cave, the diver's suit was still intact. Conrad pointed to the screen. The dive computer on the corpse's wrist was still blinking faintly. He told the court that this was not just a case of attempted murder against a father. This was a case of successful murder to silence a witness. Bennett had cut Conrad's air, and when Miller, the dive master, saw it and panicked, Bennett had severed his line too and shoved him into the cave to die. The forensic team had already identified the body. It was Miller. And wrapped around his belt was the knife used to cut the air hoses, a knife with Bennett's initials engraved on the handle. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, the kind of silence that happens when evil is exposed in its rawest form. Bennett did not scream this time. He simply stared at the floor, the weight of the dead pressing down on him, burying him under a truth that the ocean refused to keep. The screen faded to black, leaving a silence in the courtroom that was heavy enough to crush the lungs of everyone watching. The horrifying image of the body in the underwater cave was burned into their retinas. For a few seconds, nobody moved, as if the entire room was holding its breath collectively. Then the spell broke with the sharp, metallic sound of chains being pulled from a belt. The federal agents did not hesitate. They moved with the synchronized precision of a pack of wolves closing in on wounded prey. Monica was the first to shatter the quiet. As a female officer approached her, the realization of her fate finally pierced through her delusion. She scrambled backward, knocking her heavy oak chair over with a loud crash. She began to hyperventilate, her hands clutching her stomach, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. When the officer reached for her wrist, Monica let out a shrill, piercing scream that made the jurors flinch. She did not look at her husband, Bennett, who was already shackled. She turned her wild, desperate gaze toward Jared. She pointed a trembling finger at him, her voice cracking with hysteria. She screamed that it was all him. She shouted that she was innocent, that she was just a victim, and that Jared had forced her into the scheme. She yelled that Jared was the one who planned the dive, the one who tampered with the equipment, and the one who fathered the child she was carrying. In her panic to save herself, she torched the last bridge she had left, publicly admitting to the affair and the conspiracy in a frantic attempt to cut a deal that no one was offering. Jared, usually so smooth and composed, looked as though he had been struck by lightning. He tried to stand, to protest, to weave another one of his articulate lies, but the agents were on him instantly. They slammed him against the table, twisting his arms behind his back with a force that made him grunt in pain. The handcuffs clicked shut, a sound of finality that echoed off the high ceiling. Jared stared at Monica with pure hatred, realizing that the woman he had conspired with was now burying him to save her own skin. The prosecutor stood up and spoke over the chaos, his voice booming. He announced that given the premeditated nature of the crime, the crossing of state lines, and the murder of a federal witness in the dive master Miller, the state would be seeking the maximum penalty. This was not a white-collar crime anymore. This was a capital offense. The words death penalty and life without parole hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Conrad watched it all from his place at the defense table. He did not smile. He did not cheer. He simply watched the inevitable collapse of a house built on sand. He saw the terror in their eyes, not the terror of guilt, but the terror of consequences. They had come into this room expecting to strip him of his fortune, to leave him destitute and broken. Instead, they were leaving in chains, stripped of their assets, their reputations, and their futures. The millions they coveted were gone. The social status they worshipped was destroyed. They were no longer the golden children of high society. They were inmates in waiting. As the bailiffs began to drag them toward the side exit, Monica's legs gave out. She had to be half-carried, her expensive heels dragging across the floor, her pleas for mercy turning into incoherent sobs. Bennett sat frozen, staring at the empty space where his wife and best friend had been, realizing that every person he had trusted had been playing him, and now they were all going down together. The judge banged the gavel, dismissing the court, but the sound was barely audible over the murmur of a crowd that had just witnessed the absolute destruction of evil. Conrad gathered his files, buttoned his jacket, and prepared to walk out into the sunlight, leaving the darkness behind him. The morning mist hung low over the coastline, wrapping the world in a blanket of soft gray silence. It had been 6 months since the gavel fell, 6 months since the empire of lies collapsed under the weight of the truth. Bennett had not lasted long in the harsh reality of a federal penitentiary. The official report said heart failure, but Conrad knew it was a broken spirit. The boy who had demanded the world could not survive in a cage. Now there were no cameras, no lawyers, and no dramatic speeches. There was only Conrad standing alone on the edge of the same cliff where his son had once looked out and plotted his death. In his hands, Conrad held a simple, biodegradable urn. It was heavy, far heavier than the decorative prop Bennett had placed on the mantel. This was real. This was the final physical weight of a life that had lost its way. Conrad looked out at the churning Atlantic Ocean. The water that had almost become his grave was now going to be his son's final resting place. There was a poetic justice to it, but Conrad felt no triumph, only a deep, hollow ache where his anger used to be. He opened the lid and let the wind catch the ashes, watching them swirl and dance for a moment, before disappearing into the gray waves below. He whispered a final goodbye, not to the monster who had tried to kill him, but to the memory of the little boy he had once nursed through a fever. That boy was gone long before today, but now Conrad could finally let the ghost go. He turned away from the sea and walked back to his car. He did not look back. The past was buried in the deep, and the future was waiting. Conrad had decided that the fortune Bennett had been so desperate to steal would not sit idle in a bank account. He had liquidated the estate, sold the vacation homes, and auctioned off the luxury cars. With the proceeds, he established the Phoenix Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing high-quality legal defense for the elderly who were being exploited by their families. He hired the best lawyers, the sharpest investigators, and the most compassionate social workers. Every dollar that Bennett had tried to take was now being used to stop men like him. The final scene of this tragedy took place not in a courtroom, but in a small, quiet cafe in a city where nobody knew his name. Conrad sat at a corner table, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him. The morning sun had burned off the mist, casting a warm golden light across the wooden table. He watched the world go by through the window. Couples holding hands, children running to school, the simple, chaotic beauty of life continuing. He took a sip of his coffee. It was bitter and hot, a grounding sensation that reminded him he was alive. There was no family gathering waiting for him. There were no grand dinners or holiday plans. The chair opposite him was empty, and it likely always would be. But as he took a deep breath, he realized that the crushing weight on his chest was gone. He was alone, yes, but he was free. He was safe. He had walked through the fire, he had been drowned in the depths, and he had surfaced. Conrad placed the cup down and allowed a small, faint smile to touch his lips. It was the smile of a man who had lost everything that didn't matter, only to find the one thing that did. He was a survivor. And for today, that was enough. Conrad's story serves as a powerful reminder that family is not defined by DNA, but by loyalty and respect. We often cling to toxic relationships simply because they share our last name, believing that sacrifice is the only way to show love. But there is a line where patience becomes self-destruction. True dignity is realizing that you do not owe your life to those who only wish to consume it. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from the people you raised to find the peace you deserve. It is better to be alone in truth than surrounded by lies. If Conrad's victory brought you satisfaction, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice and the strength of the human spirit.